Hey guys, welcome and thank you so much for tuning in to Let's Be Blunt with Montel. Today I got to tell you something. I got a really special guest who is passionate about the wellness properties of cannabis and an expert in the field of cannabis education. She's a dedicated cannabis educator at Stockton University in South Jersey, where she teaches courses in cannabis undergraduate program and also contributes to their Cannabis Studies Certification program. She brings a unique perspective on how communication shapes public perceptions of cannabis. We'll be discussing her unique insights in the cannabis history, communication strategies, and the education's role in destigmatizing this powerful plant. And it's just Angela Speman. Thanks so much for joining us today on Let's Be Blunt with Montel.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here.
I'm so glad you are here. You know, it's one of the things that I've been doing this podcast now for almost 5 years and 4.5 years. And I got to tell you, I've talked about it no less than 400 times, I think. You know, and we've got a large library now. I keep talking about the fact, and I still believe it today, that education is the most important part of this industry that this industry has still failed to embrace, from my perspective. Let's back up a little bit and let's talk a little bit about what your experience has been, and both professional and personal, and what inspired you to even become a cannabis educator to begin with. So let's go back. Where'd you grow up? Where'd you go to school? What's your degree in? And what moved you towards cannabis?
Well, I couldn't agree with you more that education needs to be a front and center topic all the time. And I'm really appreciative for advocates like you that are so vigilant in helping people access this information. My background is in communications. By trade, I'm a communication strategist, and I've been working in nonprofit communities and higher education communities for quite some time. And during that whole time, I was a communication strategist in nonprofits and higher ed. I believed in the cannabis properties that are associated with wellness. I believe that this ends up being part of who I am, and the opportunity to share education with folks when it comes to cannabis has been really important to me, but there was not a clear pathway for that. And I was actually working in Trenton for a statewide nonprofit that really was designed to help people tackle tough topics and how communities get better and manage some difficult conversations. And while I was there, I was learning about how, education is the pathway forward. And during my lunch breaks, I would actually take walks to stretch my legs. And the medical marijuana advocates that were out there every week tirelessly and consistently trying to share messaging with anyone that they could, that was really impressive to me. And having that access in Trenton to see the advocacy and knowing that I have been a proponent of cannabis as a wellness substance for years, I really wanted to get involved. And at that point, as an individual, I joined our state's new at the time, New Jersey Cannabis Business Association. And what had been happening in my own personal life was lots and lots and lots of reading, lots of history. And that's how I ended up almost, in an accidental cannabis historian role. And it was a very selfishly motivated, education and seeking out all the information that I could, because I found that when I was having conversations in my personal life and when appropriate in my professional life, fact-based information ended up being the most fruitful conversations moving forward. So that immersion happened, and it's been a snowball ever since.
Well, I understand what you're saying in one sense, but at the other sense, as important as education and the history of cannabis is, it seems as if this industry has kind of like moved away from that. I don't know why. I don't get it. You can go into some dispensaries and talk to managers who don't even have, I believe, the basic knowledge of, America's history with cannabis.
And that history is so essential because what I have realized in my classes at Stockton, both for the undergraduate program, so they've had a minor program and a certification program since 2018, 2019 ish. And they're currently standing up an undergraduate major, a business focused major. So Stockton, I'm very proud to be affiliated with Stockton because they were, higher ed pioneers in the space. And there is still so much hesitancy to get involved because so many colleges and universities receive federal funding. So
But
the
wait, even if your college or university receives federal funding, there's not a prohibition on the First Amendment. But are you telling me that colleges feel like there is a First Amendment prohibition in even talking about cannabis? There's something odd about that to me.
I totally agree. And that's why you're seeing more and more programs and certifications popping up now and more universities like testing the waters, like taking baby steps in. But that's why programs like Stockton's and some of the other wonderful cannabis education programs around the country have been so important because they really, they stepped forward at a time where it was and still remains in that sector a very a thing that makes everyone very nervous.
I understand being nervous, but I do not understand as an educational institution that probably teaches some sort of course on American history that
Mhm.
understands what the U.S. Constitution is would kowtow to pressure to not even talk about cannabis. I mean, this whole idea that, you can't promote cannabis, I get that. Brand wise, cultivar wise, you probably are skirting a line if you were to talk about cannabis in some way that came across as if it is promoting the purchase of. But if you are just educating, we don't erase. Well, yeah, I'm sorry, this country does do that. This country does erase facts from history. But most collegiate institutions across this country have kind of stood by the moniker that education is part of our individual right to be educated and to gain knowledge, whether it is an illegal substance or not. I mean, you could teach a course on LSD, even though LSD is not a legal product. Teaching LSD and the fact that LSD existed, the fact that our government experimented with it, the fact that it was utilized, or teaching a course talking about the fact that the entire Revolutionary Army was clothed in hemp. All our forefathers grew hemp. There cannot be a moratorium on that kind of knowledge. So I'm just trying to understand what is the fear on the part of a university in just teaching knowledgeable information.
I actually think that it ends up coming down to stigma a lot of the time, and there's lots of reasons, there's lots of rationale down on paper, but I've seen it myself where there are individuals that will say one thing, but really what it comes down to is fear and fear of the unknown, and that has so much to do with this, this programming that many of us have received. And this programming goes back over 100 years. Your knowledge base of history, I know that you're already well aware of all of these efforts that built upon each other. And so that stigma and that fear, that's actually something that I explore a lot in both my students, my undergrad students, and then that community certification aspect and other community programming that I do, where we have to start talking about what that fear is. Because the people that are making the decisions about policy, about setting up new programs, about having, even conversations about conversations involving cannabis, that fear and that stigma is so ingrained in the core of so many folks that that's why messaging that comes across, that's why the interviews that you do on this podcast are so important, because it's normalizing the topic.
But I'm hearing you. I hear you, but I could not see holding. I've had conversations with governors, senators, congressmen, and would dare them to even for 1 second try to hold me to some standard that doesn't allow me to, utilize my constitutional right, a First Amendment, of freedom of speech, to talk about something from an educational standpoint. I can't promote individual products, but to talk about cannabis as a historical fact of nature is a fact. And I do not understand why any university would fear talking about cannabis any more than they would fear talking about aspirin, talking about, the history of how we used willow bark for thousands of years, understanding it had medicinal purposes. That is not promoting willow bark. That's just telling the truth.
Absolutely. And I mean, that's why I'm so proud to be affiliated with Stockton, because that they do not, they have not stopped, and they've added more courses that have to do with all aspects of the plant. And, there's a practical side of this too. Earlier this year, the New Jersey government, released a report that's indicating that in New Jersey, in 2024, this is anticipated to be a $1 billion big industry. And we need a trained workforce, and we need everyone, whether you're plant touching or not, or whether you're just adjacent to the industry or not. This history ends up being so important, because if there are individuals that maintain uninformed perspective when it comes to cannabis, and let stigma and fear interfere with decisions that they might make, then that is limiting what's happening. I have some students that have experienced even some commentary from potential employers outside of the cannabis industry, that because they are publicly associated with the industry in an academic and professional way, that might hinder their opportunities for jobs in the non-cannabis space later. So this topic just touches so many different things, that normalization and talking about, history and educating folks in general, the basics and where we've come from to better predict where we're going, is an absolute necessity for the success of this industry, and to advance topics in social equity and social justice, because we are still in a place right now where there are people that are sitting in prison for this plant, while there's
There are
another
still
side.
people. There are people going to prison every day for this plant, still,
Yeah.
right now.
Yeah.
We'll talk a little bit about you. You were just getting ready to dig into Stockton. Let's talk a little bit about the cannabis communication courses that you design. What courses do you actually teach?
So I teach cannabis and communications focused courses. And really what it's doing is using history as the vehicle. And right now, in our semester, we travel through a global look. And one of the big takeaways that students let me know, that they, kind of, when the light bulb goes off towards the end of the semester and they think back to the patterns they saw, the fact is, when we historically look from a global perspective, even hundreds of years ago,
Thousands.
this and thousands of years ago as well, this plant was certainly here. But once we had more documentation of human experience, and that was more readily available, controversy follows this plant around pretty consistently. And it has to do, and a lot of scholars that write on this topic have a lot of really exploratory research that indicates that there's fear when it comes to authority figures, because cannabis, not only as a medicine, but also as a sacrament, and different aspects of that individualized cannabis experience, it can promote free thinking. It can promote concepts of being able to heal oneself. And that has typically been a huge threat to authority and to those in charge. And there's been patterns that we can learn from historically. And when I talk with students about that, they are understanding why it is so important to share pertinent information, because it's education and conversation between people that helps people to replace bad misinformation, that all of that cannabis myth, and replace it with good facts and good science.
I mean, well, especially when you're talking about the fact that it does promote free thinking. I mean, most of these people don't even understand this is how this thing called our Constitution and Declaration of Independence even came to be. Because for anybody who doesn't believe that our forefathers weren't, we know that cannabis was an integral part of the formation of the United States of America. Had we not had hemp and not being able to sell hemp, America would not exist. Hemp was being, produced by all of our forefathers, George Washington being one of them, and being grown and being used for everything from fabrics to textiles to actual consumption and eating the seeds and other things like that, going back to like the late 1600s. So, I mean, for anybody to not recognize that, if they didn't think that those guys sitting around in a room who were coming up with this idea of an independent nation that was, based on, the votes of all, didn't come from a bunch of people who actually were utilizing this plant, they're crazy.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, in Virginia, hemp was legal tender at one point in the
Hemp was
1600s.
hemp was legal tender, and you could pay your taxes with hemp
Mhm.
through all of the Americas. I
And
don't know if you know that, yeah.
we've just moved so far away from this, and then we have all of this other evidence that would indicate that around the turn of the century, as more black and brown people were coming to America and bringing this plant with them, and we had already had some presence because it was ironically hemp in the 15 and 1600s that allowed for global travel to help this plant move all over the world.
Yeah, the 1500s, you're right. And, the plant had been here all along. You go back and look at newspapers printed in 1885, you see cannabis based tincture products there. The only reason why part of the issue, not part, but 90% of the issue was race, based on the fact that you had one guy, Anslinger, who was the head of prohibition for alcohol, lost his job. And while he was the head of prohibition for alcohol, he had several speeches where he talked about, extolled the virtues of cannabis being a kind of intoxicating, but would not cause the violence and those kinds of things. He was a supporter of cannabis until he lost his job for alcohol. And then he got the funding from Hearst and from DuPont to go after those darkies. That's what was the whole issue was.
Well, and Anslinger is a notorious figure in cannabis history, and his desire to keep his job, and have some sort of alternative to prohibition ending, and then this is happening when the Depression is occurring, and the FBN is founded under the Department of Treasury, and this is a main component to the passage of the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act, where this had to do with things that had nothing to do with this amazing plant.
Correct. And then we went on to vilify, and even while vilifying during the 40s, during World War II, we had the Hemp for Victory Act passed. So forcing the country to grow it again. And then we tried to force the rest of the world to stop, actually trading in hemp in 62. And now we see that over 200 nations around the world have now pulled out of that signatory for the UN treaty and are now deeply, deeply in hemp and cannabis, which is, I'm dealing with people all over the world, from South Africa to Colombia to Isle of Man to Spain to Europe, all of which are getting ready to leave us in the dust when it comes to cannabis.
Absolutely. And when we think about the research, right? Not necessarily on the hemp side, but the research side, and we look at countries like Israel, we look at the Netherlands, we look at Canada, we have this American ego a lot of the time where we're saying, unless it's come through our stuff, our NIH, we are not going to take this as seriously as we should. And that's a huge problem. The program,
Even though we funded some of that research in the 80s in Israel, we're the ones who funded that research. So it's really, I think, just kind of mind-boggling how we can turn our backs on the funds that we spent. Remember, we gave Dr. Meshulam one of the highest NIDA awards back 2000, 2001 for all of his research in understanding the endocannabinoid system.
Montel, you are just a constant source of information, and you really know your history. And it's
I've been working in this for 24 years. This has not been yesterday. I didn't come to this as part of the green rush. I came to this before most of the states right now were even thinking about being legal. Back when I got involved, I think I I probably testified before 7, 8 different legislatures across the country. But back when we had less than 16 countries, 16 states that had some sort of marijuana reform law. So I've been involved in this for quite a long time. And just like yourself, not just fascinated, but moved by the fact that hemp cannabis has been such an integral part of mankind's existence. And, no matter how hard we try to rewrite history here in the United States, you can't get rid of what's already there.
Well said. And our movement away from plant medicine and just concepts of being able to look to nature. Most folks I have found don't realize that over 40%, maybe even over 50% of what's on our pharmacist shelves right now is all based in plant medicine. And
Correct. That most people don't get the fact that what they've done is they find a plant because they knew they couldn't patent the plant. They replicated the plant's one or two of the plant's constituent parts, and then try to get a patent on that, and then try to shut down the plant based on the patent on some stupidity. I mean, I can go all the way back to when the first cannabis drug was issued a patent, which was Marinol, was one of the dumbest drugs ever created in America. Still available right
yes,
now. A lot of people don't know that. You can still get it, but it's probably one of the most expensive drugs in the country today. People don't know that. Why? Because they tried to isolate Delta 9 in a strange way, synthesizing Delta 9, not recognizing that all the other constituent parts of the plant, from the phyto, from the terpenes to the everything, every part of the plant, literally plays a role in this entire effect that our individual endocannabinoid system has the ability to recognize. We didn't realize that, so we came up with this drug. I've taken Marinol, and one of the strangest things I've ever consumed in my life, because it had such a weird effect on my body. Nothing close to what you get from the plant.
and all of those studies would indicate the efficacy of that is just poor in comparison to the real non-patented thing. So
Right.
that's why it ends up being so important to have the conversations and let folks know that the narratives that they've been fed, the indoctrination that they have, that has also been passed down generationally. So there's this component
Right.
of individuals receiving messages from their first family and from all these influences, school and church and all of these different kinds of social factors. And when we in class, when we kind of start to talk about why it can be so mind-boggling that a person that is intelligent and balanced and aware can be so, no, I do not want to hear information. I am steadfast in my belief that this plant and the people associated with it are bad, are negative, are deviant, are criminals, and all of these things that takes so much effort to convince someone. Because what part of what we explore in class is that our identity is made up of attitudes, beliefs, and values, these three distinct areas that our experiences inform and color how we see the world. And what we've come to realize is that cannabis is not necessarily only in that attitude, which is like or dislike of something. It actually has more to do with beliefs and values and that moral consideration of how we see the world. And that's why it takes such a long time, but kind of focusing in on fact-based and asking for feedback, like encouraging the conversation so that a good discussion can start to poke holes in all of these things that we know that we might believe, but we're not actually sure why, because DARE really did have an effect in third grade. What your pastor said about people that use drugs and tied it to marijuana when you were in eighth grade really can.
And the same pastor is sipping out of the holy chalice every Saturday or Sunday or Monday. Yeah, whatever. I'm like so sick of hearing these moralistic people try to come up with a reason to hate. Because, I mean, if we really get to the bottom line of this, this really has less to do with the plant and more to do with the hate in the hearts of American people who needed to figure out a way to discriminate against people that didn't look like them. So therefore, they would try to blame it on them, knowing that more people who look like them were consuming the product anyway.
Absolutely. And that is historically a pattern where there is, it's been used as a tool of oppression constantly. And even that, when we think about alcohol, and I have concerns all the time for how many people want to put alcohol and cannabis together, because the comparisons are problematic much of the time. And, I've never had a doctor prescribe a beer for me to go and address some sort of health issue. That's just not how it's done.
And you've never had a doctor say to you that any cannabis kills brain cells.
Well, and
We do know that
we
alcohol does.
do. And when we go back into some of those historical texts, in particular in like the 17 and 1800s, as there were people talking about, arguing about the cannabis controversy even then, you had this pride some of the time that's referenced in some of these writings that we're drinking people. We're not lesser than people because we're not using those mind altering drugs. We are better because we utilize this substance to achieve this kind of outcome. And it is really frustrating when you go back and you read all of this, because this was definitely a factor upon factor in how this messaging about this cannabis plant being tied to negative and awful associations really, expanded.
And we also do have to understand that, at the same time the negative was out there, the masses were using. Let's, for some reason, we as modern humans seem to believe that, history isn't really history. Everything started in America in 1900 rather than starting way back when man first came to live in communities. But we know for a fact that, back in the day where you had no toilet paper, remember, people used to have to go out into the woods and dig a little hole and grab a couple leaves. Back when you didn't sleep on a mattress, you slept on the ground. Back when there was no air conditioning, back when there was no heat, back when, there wasn't, most people in this country don't understand why is there such a drive towards alcohol, because everyone in the world, even babies, drank alcohol in the 16, 17, 1800s. Why did they do that, Montel? Well, they did that because you couldn't drink the water out of the stream. Most people don't recognize the fact that, upstream from you, about, 50 yards, lions, tigers, and bears, oh my, were doing their, do things in the water. That was coming downstream. You picked up the water, you drank some of it, you were not getting away with not getting sick. So what did they have to do? They had to boil the water, and after they boiled the water, what do? They put low amounts of alcohol in it to see if they could kill back. They didn't even know what bacteria was, but they knew that they made alcohol out of it, that they could at least survive the night and the next night and the next night. And so therefore, if you go back and look, humans didn't seek to drink water. They were given, babies were given 2.5, 3.0 beer, 3.0 alcohol drinks, because that was the only thing that you could stomach and not kill you. So it's so crazy that we just pick and choose what parts of history. Well, there must have been air conditioning back in 1605. There was no air conditioning. I mean, George Washington wasn't sitting on his back porch smoking a tobacco cigar. You know what George was smoking. You know what all of them were smoking. Why? Because they felt a little bit better. Come on, if you lived back then getting bit by mosquitoes and having to go to sleep on the floor, and then finally somebody got you a hay-filled mattress that still got you bit the crap before you woke up in the morning, you want to get a good night's sleep. So, smoking on one of those things that help you get a night's sleep. Look, even sailors at sea during the 1700s, you had your right to a ration of rope. Why did you have a right to a ration of rope? Because the rope was made from hemp. Why? Hemp, and we didn't distinguish. There was no arbitrary number of 0.2%, 0.1%, 0.3%. There was no arbitrary number back then. So they weren't really smoking hemp. They were smoking cannabis. They were eating cannabis. They were eating seeds. Of course, they weren't getting high off of it because there's no, cannabinoids in existence in the seed itself until it starts to get past 6 weeks old. However, they were eating that. Why? Because mankind knew in the 1600s that hemp was one of the most protein laden seeds on the planet. The ship left Europe. They left with a ton of seeds, of marijuana seeds. Duh. The guy said, why? Because it didn't rot in the seawater.
There is no other plant like it. And I believe that that is what
Right.
then motivates people that are working in the space. And a lot of credit has to be given to all of the folks. You mentioned the green rush earlier, and you mentioned how all of this is feeling so contemporary. But people like you and people that have been advocating for this for decades, and the risk was so much higher, and the risk still remains, especially depending on who you are and where you are, which is awful. But I think that we have to acknowledge that spreading this information, we are doing this on the backs of those that have come before us, people like you that have made this kind of difference to normalize these conversations, because those seeds are packed with nutrients. That has to be part of the narrative as you're trying to explain to someone that what the blocks that they have about this plant have nothing to do with the plant, but have to do with the constant level of programming that's been done. And much of that is government oriented, and it ends up having this trickle down effect that really.
With thousands of years of the use of this plant, and then in less than 100 years, we completely vilify it and turn it into something that we need a government to approve, which is really just asinine to me. I don't understand it. But, tell me about, look, communication as we see right now. You and I are communicating. Communication is a key tool, and how can we get broader conversations to help that communication strategize how to shape public opinion?
Well, if I have a few minutes with someone, like in an elevator or cocktail party or situation like that, I have found that even starting with the category 1 classification, that John Q and Jane Q public out there tend to not realize the ins and outs of that it's based on those 2 criteria: no medicinal value and high potential for abuse. And you see a little
Both of which are
the
not true.
flicker of that light bulb when someone says, well, wait a second, what do you mean no medicinal value? Don't they have medical programs in the world? And then to be able to follow up and say, well,
All
right.
over the
And,
world.
and just in our country, over 40 states, DC, and 4 of the 5 territories have a medicinal program. And the person, you kind of see the processing. You say, oh, well, that doesn't make sense, because you don't even have to go far at this point to talk to somebody that cannabis has changed their lives. It's your neighbor, it's your cousin, it's your best friend from high school. It's all.
But they're so afraid to talk about it these days. I'm really taken aback by the fact that, other than like yourself, who's doing this publicly at a school, at a university, and trying to persuade more and more to have these conversations. I got to tell you, it's everywhere. I can't say it any other way than that. It's everywhere. You can walk out. I live in Miami, or I go to New York. I take 2 steps down a city block in New York. It's there. I can smell it reeking in the air. Here in Miami, it's there. It's in the air. It's everywhere. So I mean, but the fact that it is everywhere, you don't see that many people having conversations about it. We know for a fact in the last 3 years here in America, and especially this last year, cannabis sales outperformed cigarettes and either came close to, or I'm talking about total sales. I'm not just talking about legal sales. Legal sales in the legal market represents about $29 billion to $30 billion a year right now. In the black and gray market, we know that that's at least 3 to 4 times greater than that. So that means that we're probably $120 billion worth of sales of cannabis in America. That competes with alcohol. That actually completely thwarts, or not thwarts, but overshadows the sales of cigarettes. We know for a fact we already sell more cannabis than we do milk. Think of all the grocery stores in America, and we sell more cannabis right now than we sell milk. More cannabis than we sell all the energy drinks put together. So that's a large part, and it's not like 3 or 4 people buying all that either. So you got a large percentage of people in this country who are doing it, but they're afraid to still come out of the shadows. It's almost as if we've gone back in the shadows in the last 3 or 4 years.
Yes. And, I think that, I don't know about you, but anytime I go to a function of any kind, and as soon as I talk about being in cannabis education, and I also make it a point to not just work at Stockton and helping enrolled students, but I also host public programs where it is an opportunity for people to come out and ask questions. And
You host a podcast. This use this as you see
I
fit.
do.
The diary of Mary, right?
So that podcast is trickery because it tricks people into learning cannabis history. It's almost like it's a
Mhm.
fun mystery podcast that specifically is designed to help people understand historical moments in a way that feels accessible. But
Let me ask you a question. Do you go back? I mean, honestly, if you can go to any library in America, get the microfiche, take a look at the classified section of the newspaper after 1880, and all you'll see, I mean, like 40% of the ads back there are hemp-based, cannabis-based tinctures or things like that. Because why? We were living at a time where we had just come out of the Civil War. We had a population that had probably 40 to 45% of us all suffering from some sort of an injury that took place during that war. And people needed to figure out how to, again, just exist. There was no air conditioning, there was no heat. I mean, people were trying to figure out how to exist back there at the turn of the century. And so cannabis was being used, and we act as if this was something that was just on the fringes and that those Mexicans and dark people brought into the country, but it was being used here in America pervasively.
absolutely. And that, like the shift after that Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, which was not focused on cannabis, that was where you see some of the tide starting to turn. And it's not a coincidence that you see, major pharmaceuticals. Aspirin is patented in 1899. And that is about 50 years after the invention of the hypodermic needle, which
And still never FDA approved until I think about 10 years ago. Most people don't know that. Aspirin was never FDA
and
approved.
like
Never.
even though we like that is our this is safe and this is okay, like it's stuff like that where, to your point from earlier, we pick and choose what history we want to pay attention to and what history we disregard depending on what suits our bias a lot of the time.
And aspirin, yeah, when you say that, aspirin is probably one of the most deadly drugs in the entire country that you can get. You can send your 9-year-old or 10-year-old to a grocery store. They're not supposed to be able to buy it, but they can buy it at a grocery store. A 10-year-old can walk up to the counter, put a whole bunch of groceries up there in a bottle of aspirin. If they're in that person at the counter will just beep it through and put it in their bag. And they really shouldn't do that to a child because we know for a fact that the child can go home, eat half that bottle, and be dead on the kitchen floor.
This is 100% true. And we were actually in class not too long ago. We were talking about the Schaefer report that came out in the 70s. I want to say 73. And it was Pennsylvania governor, ex former governor at the time, Raymond Schaefer. And this was one of many government issued reports. And this was one of the first to put down on paper that there had not been a single fatality attributed solely to, cannabis and, as they were saying at the time, marijuana consumption. And this is major because this is government issue and only 3 years after the Controlled Substance Act. And this is backed up by Ledane, Wooten, LaGuardia, and 44. All of these other reports keep saying the same thing, that marijuana is not the villain that has been painted. And you see other aspects of information about its safety in comparison to other substances. And aspirin, we like to think of as innocuous, as something that is completely safe, but it kills more people every year than cannabis. And I don't want anyone
Correct.
to perish or anything like that. But when we look to the numbers, this is important for folks that have a bias and a predetermined mindset, because again, this is all programming, messaging and programming.
And that's all part of understanding generational
Yep.
perspectives. Can you share a little bit more about that with our listeners?
Absolutely. And whether in the public programs that I host or in the Stockton classrooms, we don't have to go that far back. So when we're looking at, let's say, the average age of a college student, and for easy numbers, let's say 20. So if that 20-year-old has grandparents that were born in, let's say, the 1950s, those were individuals that were coming of age in this post marijuana tax act, post headlines, and we know that they were orchestrated by some of these powers that be. William Randolph Hearst comes up, DuPont comes up, all of these headlines that were scaring people in the 20s into the 30s into the 40s. So that if you are 20 at present and your grandparents heard that message from their parents and grandparents, we are still in the realm of where people that are alive today had direct and purposeful misinformation that was designed to mislead and scare folks. And you had legislative activity, in particular in the 50s, with the Boggs Act and the Narcotic Control Act, and then how that led into the 1970, Controlled Substance Act. Look, so this, even though sometimes we think about cannabis as being this like, oh, this happened a long time ago thing, we are still dealing with that. And I don't feel comfortable just waiting 50, 60, 70 years for generations to change for this to be a normalized topic, because the people actually that could benefit the most right now, and this is a lot of the audience when I'm doing public programs with libraries and community centers, the people that could benefit the most are our current senior populations, because they're, being encouraged to get on that pharma carousel a lot of the time.
But that's also when we started off, and I was saying, unfortunately, that is part of what I think is the issue, one of the issues with our industry that we don't pay very close attention to. I mean, this industry is so focused on trying to figure out who can put out the highest THC level product there is in the marketplace, not understanding that that's not what most people in this country really want. The people, I have products in the marketplace in the Massachusetts area. I'm getting ready to have them in the market down in Georgia, and what I found is that is my generation, as they come through the door, they walk out of the dispensary with $200 and $250 worth of product. It's the 16 and 17-year-old, 18-year-old that supposedly shouldn't be 16, 17-year-old, but they are coming in there. So it's the 18-year-old to 20-year-old who walks out with one pre-roll, two pre-rolls. They buy $20 worth of product and they don't come back for 3 or 4 days, or they come back tomorrow, or they come back the next day. But $20 a day versus $200 a week, you know what I mean? We should go to the consumer who is probably right now most affected by and could get the most benefit from.
Well said. And this concept of, when sometimes people walk into dispensaries and it's the how high do you want to get, as that first interaction, especially with bud tenders and personnel that maybe would benefit, not maybe, but would benefit from additional education, even about basic things like the endocannabinoid system and why it is important to have balanced strains. Because as we start to mess around and try and increase those THC, that potency part, you're effectively messing around with the other chemical compounds, and then the second most famous cannabinoid after THC, CBD, ends up sometimes being bred right away.
Yeah, most people don't know that, really it was the Humboldt County, Northern California area of this country that literally, before anybody else in the world was doing it, we were the ones who were trying our best to breed CBD and all the other minor cannabinoids out of the plant so that we could increase the THC levels. And it wasn't until somebody said, oh, I guess that stuff is good for you too. So then they started to try to figure out how they could go take the seeds they were going to throw away, replant them, and come up with some high CBD. I'll never forget this. Go back to early 2000s, 2001, when I was first diagnosed with MS. When my journey with cannabis began, I had information that talked about, minor cannabinoid rich cannabis. And I was trying to find that. And literally, I had a couple growers up in Northern California who were like, oh, we got some high CBD stuff. If you want it, I'll just give it to you. I don't need this shit. And they were just giving it away as if it was a waste of time. And it wasn't until, 2010, 2011 that people started thinking about CBD and some of the other minors. Now all of a sudden, people are thinking about all the other minors because they finally started reading some of the research. And one of the things that most people don't believe, you hear it from a congressman or a senator or a legislator all the time. Well, when they do more research, well, I don't know, most people don't know this. Cannabis is probably one of the most researched substances on the planet right now. Back in 2001, 2021, there were over 35,000 peer-reviewed published documents on cannabis that year. The next year is almost twice as many. So there's probably around 14 to 15,000 research, peer-reviewed research, published documents around the world on cannabis. You compare that to alcohol. So compare it to alcohol, it's probably only about 1,100. Compare that to aspirin, only about 10. You know what I mean? So it's one of the most researched substances on the planet. We already now have done the validation of its efficacy.
And this ends up being like one of these things that, I'm sure that you're doing the same thing, that is a data point of this data that's being referenced in conversations to try and help people understand that this is not just, the stoner scientist that's wearing tie-dye in the back of the lab that has this one tiny little, investigation going. There are a lot of really smart scientists and doctors and healthcare professionals and researchers that are saying that this plant is the gift. This is
around the world.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. Well, here we're going to run out of time, but give me what are some of the most pervasive misconceptions that you hear when you're teaching your class?
Well, we look at real life scenarios, and there was a municipality in New Jersey that were cannabis friendly, and this becomes a huge issue because there's a municipality has to designate themselves as cannabis friendly, as an opt-in, and there's a lot of stigma and a lot of issue that comes along with that, which is why so many places opt out without even knowing about what cannabis and its medical benefits and wellness benefits and all of these things could bring. So I'm thinking of a recent assignment that everybody was working on, where there was a letter to the editor about how bringing this dispensary into their town was going to increase crime, and that they did not want that in their backyard. And there are some students that look at that and have more awareness about cannabis and what the realities are, but this association, even for the 20 somethings, is still very prevalent, where this association with cannabis and crime, because of that messaging that they received during their childhoods a lot of the time, and this gateway drug concept also is still pervasive.
That's still being perpetuated by our soon-to-be former
It
president. But go ahead.
absolutely is. And, to go back when I was mentioning that, talking about the federal classification, the categorization, when explaining that seems to help people, like help the light bulb go off. The other thing is talking about the actual origins of the gateway drug theory and Dr. Denise Candle, and sharing the actual information, and Dr. Candle's follow-up 40 years later, where she goes on to explain that there was a gateway drug. They did find that there were substances that then could lead to different substances. And number one was tobacco, and number two was alcohol. And it's because these were the accessible substances. So by providing the reality of what the gateway drug theory, and then helping someone understand how this term was misappropriated, and then once you play that, whisper down the lane, this is the narrative, this is the story, and the next person tells the next person, and the influencer tells the next person. That's how we ended up as associating these things. And that is still pervasive in students today. And I mean, students and adults, like older adults alike, but, this helping the students understand and really enter that information with a healthy level of skepticism and critical analysis, and helping them to come to conclusions on their own is a big part of my job, and a part that I take very seriously in classrooms and in public conversations, and when working with other professionals in the industry.
Are your courses available online?
So the certification course is, and the it depends on the semester and the offering, but it is available as non-matriculated, offerings as well. So it's not just restricted, to only enrolled students. If someone really wanted to take a 4 credit hour course, I'm sure that would be available to them. And I think that I'm constantly sharing texts and sending links to people and things like that. And anybody that ever indicates that they want a little bit of information, I don't wait for them to come to my class. I send them all that I can, and say, I will come to your house. I will talk to you about this. I will watch this documentary with you. And
Sure.
that ends up being really important to me.
Well, go ahead right now. Why don't you give out your stats? Where can people go to get you, get more information from you, more information about the class? Where do they go?
Well, anyone that's interested in learning more about Stockton can visit stockton.edu, and there's a full description there and recent news coverage of this exciting undergraduate program. And I also have an agency called Elucidation Strategies, where we help people make informed decisions about cannabis. And anyone that wants lots of free resources too that are downloadable on the website, that can be found at elucidationstrategies.com.
And, just from your crystal ball, where do you see the education in cannabis going in the next, say, 10 years?
Hopefully just increasing as far as depth and width, like reach in particular. And sometimes this, I see some of it as institutional education in that higher education realm. But I've been working with a group of volunteers actually in setting up a cannabis helpline that focuses on public cannabis education, because all of these things go hand in hand. The education needs are so immense when it comes to different populations in different scenarios. So I am hopeful as we normalize the topic, and we look at some sort of federal change. What that change is going to be, I'm not sure, but some sort of change that normalizes the conversation. And then as folks realize and have to grapple with something that I write about that I call the concession factor. And the concession factor is that people need something new and typically fact-based to sink their teeth into, to back off of a position that they've maintained so tightly because they have.
I call it the Chicken Little theory. You know what I mean? The sky didn't fall.
Well, and I think that that's a really fantastic way to frame that too. And that is something that would resonate, because people, there's sometimes anger, like, and that feeling of distrust when people realize that there's this whole world of truth and this whole possibility for wellness that is completely untapped because they haven't had the good information to make informed decisions.
Because they know they were lied to. Angela, I can't say thank you enough for being a part of the show today. It's been an absolute pleasure. We'd love to have you back. Can you come back sometime?
Absolutely. And I'll bring some students from the class too.
Yeah, we barely scratched the surface, and your insights on cannabis education and communication are really invaluable. And for our listeners, again, one more time, tell them where they can go. What's the dot what?
Elucidationstrategies.com.
Okay, elucidationstrategies.com. I would suggest that my viewers go and take a look at that. I'm going to say thank you so much for being a part of the show today. Thank you all for being a part of the show today and tuning in. And make sure you please join us again on the next Let's Be Blunt with Montel. Thanks for joining me on Let's Be Blunt with Montel. Please make sure you're subscribed and hit the bell to be notified when new episodes post each week. We'd love to hear your feedback also, so please send us your comments.